Right, so it's stage 4 load shedding underway currently, but with a cold front about to begin sweeping across parts of the country, brace yourselves, more intense power cuts could be on the way if demand increases. Now, earlier this week, we spoke to energy expert Matthew Cruz, now involved in solar power. He spent over a decade at Eskom. He believes we're in for many more years of load shedding and that it's actually going to get much worse over the next 5 years. And he estimates that stage 7 cuts could even be the norm in the next few years. So does this mean Eskom and government's messages that new power is going to come online soon and the power cuts are going to ease substantially by the end of next year? Were they just wildly optimistic? I'm joined now by Professor Mark Swilling, Director of the Sustainability Institute at Stellenbosch University. Prof, thanks so much for joining us. I'm hoping you can give us some clarity, because when I chatted to Matthew, I was quite disheartened because for quite a few months things have been a little bit easier. Are things going to get substantially much worse for the next 5 years before they get better?
I don't think the evidence supports that contention. Basically, what we need is 10 gigawatts of renewable energy onto the grid in order to bring load shedding to an end. And there's a very good chance that that's going to happen within the next 2 years. There's currently about 25 gigs of renewables in the pipeline, procured in various ways. And even if half of that comes online within the next maybe 2.5 years, that's going to bring load shedding to an end, and all the evidence suggests that.
So the one concern that Matthew Cruz raised, and this is something that in fact the electricity minister himself is really concerned about, and that is about extending our grid. It's not only going to cost us a ridiculous amount of money, but it also takes, in fact, I think this is your own projection, 5 to 7 years to extend the grid. So does it really matter if we're getting new power online within the next 2 years if the grid isn't upgraded for another 7?
I think that's a very simplistic reading, which doesn't really reveal the subtleties. In our report on the grid, we were able to demonstrate that you need to make a distinction between areas where there are power lines but insufficient substations. And so the low-hanging fruit is those areas. And we estimate that there's 17 gigawatts of capacity there that could be unlocked relatively quickly with substation interventions. The minister has referred to 13 gigawatts of relatively short-term availability. So it's true that if you're looking at extensions of the grid, like in the Northern Cape, where there is no spare capacity, that's the lead time there is 5 to 7 years.
I see. So in other areas, it's going to be less. Also, if mines, malls, and a lot of our homes start putting solar power on our roofs, that also inadvertently is going to ease the pressure on the grid as a whole, isn't it? Is that going to make a real substantial difference?
It's already making a substantial difference. Eskom published data last week, I think it was, which shows that there's 4.4 gigs of rooftop solar already. That is double what it was a year ago. And 2 years ago, it was pretty negligible. So there is a massive accelerated pace of rooftop solar installation. And that is definitely easing the pressure on the grid. And there's a very good chance that it could double again in the next 12 months.
So that's fantastic news. Of course, there's always a spanner in the works somewhere, and at the moment it seems to be Coburg. That refurbishment of the units at the nuclear power station, I think we're meant to be finished by the end of the year. The minister also saying, look, actually it's going to take longer. Could that delay our return to a lot less load shedding?
It's pretty. All the indications are that Coburg is not going to come online as quickly as everybody hoped. So that is going to put more pressure on the grid, but eventually it will come online. And together with the fixing of Kusile, we really start getting into, start getting close to what the minister and the chair of the board of Eskom are talking about, which is a 60% energy availability factor. It still is a bit optimistic, and we need to accept that there's always unplanned outages because of the problematic nature of the generation machine. But nevertheless, there's a little bit of grounds for optimism there.
So give me your projection. This time next year, or let's say the end of 2024, what is our load shedding going to be looking like? Are we still going to be sitting with stages 4, 5 and 6, or is it going to be substantially lighter at, say, levels 1, 2 and 3?
Well, what we need to accept is that during the course of 2022, some fairly fundamental decisions were taken about lifting the cap on embedded energy. And then the budget speech in February, we had the Minister of Finance announcing the tax incentives for rooftop solar. And then we've had the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy announcing the bid windows 7 and 8, 5 gigs each. So if you look at the 9 gigs of embedded generation in the pipeline that NECOM refers to, the National Electricity Crisis Committee, and you add that to the 10 in bid window 7 and 8, and you add that to roughly 2.5 still to come from bid windows 5 and 6, maybe a bit more. It's looking pretty healthy, and I think by the end of 2024, as the renewables come online, we are going to see a fairly significant drop in load shedding, and we just must pray that with the elections coming up, there's no political interference in all of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Politics has played far too substantial a role in Eskom's decisions over the decades. In 10 years' time, Mark, what do you see our electricity looking like? Do you think we'll get through this, learn some hard lessons, and have a transformed sector?
Well, it's already underway. The National Transmission Company has basically been separated out and we're just waiting for the final board members and then for that National Transmission Company to get up and running, and it will own the transmission assets, and that in turn will make it possible to start significantly extending the grid, because that'll be a new fresh balance sheet and it'll be able to raise the capital. And as the Minister of Finance announced in February, you can concession off build, operate, transfer kind of arrangements to mobilize the capital. So I don't agree with Matthew's pessimism on that score. Yes, a lot of money is needed to extend the grid, but it's possible. I also think that the generation, we will see far less coal in 10 years' time, and we will see a lot more storage, battery storage, gas storage, to back up our renewables-based grid. And there will be a distribution company that will handle the downstream infrastructure. So I think what we'll see is all around the country, large-scale, utility-scale wind and solar. We'll see a lot more on rooftops, and we will see a lot of malls, factories, mines with their own embedded generation plants. And that's what the future looks like in 2010.
All right, thank you so much. So that's his 10-year projection. Professor Mark Swilling, Director of the Sustainability Institute at Stellenbosch University. A much brighter picture. He says things are well underway to give us a much better schedule of load shedding by the end of next year. So don't despair. Sounds like things are happening.